Greetings, students. Mr. Little here, and today we're going to take a look at Chapter 23, Part 2, State Building in Early Modern Europe. Now, by the end of this history bite, you should be able to answer the following essential questions. How did political continuities and changes come from social and economic policies of the states involved in Europe at the time? And how did the different states of Europe evolve without the restoration of a continent-wide empire? So really quick, we've talked about empire a lot in this particular course, and throughout most of the history of the regions that we're discussing, they were dominated to some extent by a central large empire like China or the Mughals or the Ottomans or the West African empires in Africa. So Europe is sort of an exception there. After the fall of Rome and then the fall of Charlemagne's empire, there really was never a single empire that dominated the continent effectively. Charles V of Spain and Austria sought to change all of that. He ruled via the House of Habsburg, and he attempted to restore the idea of empire in Europe. To do so, he waged long and expensive wars against the rebels who were fighting against him in the Netherlands, the Ottoman Empire, who was besieging his Austrian holdings in Vienna, as well as the Protestant princes who were embracing Martin Luther's new ideas. Now, you might think that's really expensive, and it was really expensive. Thankfully, Charles V, being King of Spain, also had all of the silver from the New World. We'll talk more about that. But it allowed him to wage these wars. Unfortunately, that also drove some of his enemies together, like the French, who were Catholic Christians, and the Ottoman Empire, in an effort to stop Spain from becoming the dominant power. Charles envisioned a unified Europe under Catholicism, under the Church, which the Protestant princes promptly rejected and did not accept at all. He sought to use the Church as a way to increase his own power. But like an empire, Charles did allow all of his realms, his territories, some kind of autonomy. He let the Netherlands speak their Dutch language. He let his French territories speak their French language. So he did follow a lot of the models we see of an empire having a unifying idea, but also allowing a certain degree of autonomy. But in the end, he just was not able to effectively crush Protestantism or drive off the Ottomans, and his successors would lose control of the Netherlands. And so his failure eventually led to the creation of what we call the new states in Europe. And in the end, he divided his realm into two, giving one to his son and one to his cousin. His son, Philip II, would eventually go on to lose the Spanish Armada against Queen Elizabeth I. And so this effort at empire rebuilding ended in failure. You can see here how he had such extensive territory. Europe, anywhere in green, was Charles V's territory. So as a result, we have a series of new states that start to pop up. Now, we talked a little bit in Chapter 19 about the regional states, and this is sort of a continuation of the growth of the regional states. So some of those tendencies that we saw in those regional states to collect finances continued to evolve during this time. Monarchs began to impose direct taxes upon their people. They began to encourage overseas expansion as a way to enrich the crown via mercantilism. And if they embraced Protestantism, they might get rich by taking some church property. They also gained greater control over their peasants or over the land. So for example, in England, the local lords took much closer control of the land by kicking the peasants off the land and into the cities. Whereas in Russia, the opposite was true. Peter the Great gave his nobles, called Boyars, he gave them more control over the peasants on their land. And so whether it was control of the land or control of the peasants, the nobles continued to solidify their hold over the peoples. And sometimes rulers would try to control their nobles, but it depended on which kingdom we're talking about. There were also much bigger armies. And I mentioned before that the scientific revolution allowed for bigger guns, which helped with bigger armies. A guy named Maurice of Nassau also launched a series of military reforms. He was fighting with the Dutch against the Spanish, and he created essentially what we call the first modern military drill. He taught his men how to reload and fire a musket in steps, or it might have been 12 steps, in a series of steps. And he taught them how to do that, and then they practiced it over and over and over and over again. So armies became larger, they became disciplined, and now with the addition of guns and gunpowder, monarchs no longer needed to rely on nobles who were knights to do the fighting for them or to raise troops. Monarchs could do it themselves. And they were helped along by religious authority. And whether that meant they were Catholic and used the Spanish Inquisition or the Jesuits to maintain authority throughout their land, or they were Protestants who took the land and the authority of the church away from them and gave it to themselves, like King Henry of England, who made himself the head of the English church. These new states in general saw a much higher degree of power concentrated in monarchs. And this sort of contrasts with the feudalism that we were still seeing in chapter 19. So let's quick talk about the constitutional states. Now, it's funny, we call them constitutional states, didn't actually have a constitution, but what they did have was limited government. Now, England is the first one that we want to look at. And after, it should be noted that after 1707, England became the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, or Great Britain. And through a long series of events, England established a representative body. And then eventually that representative body gained so much power via the execution of a king and then later the choosing of a new king, that effectively the king did not have any real authority anymore. If you're English or you've been to England, you know that the king and the queen are still very important to the English people, but the king themselves did not have as much power as their predecessors had by this time. And so this is a kind of limited government, which is also sort of an Enlightenment idea. And in fact, the English situation inspired John Locke to come up with his 2 treatises on government, and where he said people have natural rights and life, liberty, and property. You also have an example from the Netherlands, who were busy fighting this long 80-year war of independence from Spain. Because the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, or it may not have been 17, a number of provinces that spoke Dutch and called themselves the United Province of the Netherlands came together to fight the Spanish. They did not want to give one of their own too much power, or else they may just become another monarch or warlord. So they created an office called the Stadtholder, which was sort of an elected monarch of the various provinces, like a representative, if you will. And each province was allowed a great degree of autonomy, although they came together to work for a lot of policies. So, for example, they had a common currency, but nonetheless, there was a great degree of freedom across the provinces. And the Stadtholder was beholden to the various wealthy families of the Netherlands. In fact, there's one very funny story where a Stadtholder had become incredibly unpopular with the people, as well as the royal families, the various noble families. And he was killed by a mob while he was trying to get his brother out of jail. And the mob then proceeded to eat him. And I don't mean like they literally tore him apart because they were starving. I mean, they created a fire, they lined up, and they each took a piece of him, and they ate him after they killed him. So beware, you may get eaten by your people. But it's a humorous, if macabre, example of the limited power of government, where leaders could literally be eaten by their people. On the other hand, you had the absolute monarchies, where rulers ruled absolutely over their lords and their nobles and their people. Now, part of the reason rulers were able to rule absolutely was because they had direct control of their militaries, and they had a much higher degree of control over their taxes than they previously had been able to. Right. And so, for example, France, with its famous son king, Louis XIV, he asserted all of his authority by defeating his rivals in a civil war called the Fronde, which occurred when he was literally, I think he had just taken the throne as a boy. I think he was 10 years old. And he then had to, at 10, he had to defeat all of his rival lords and claimants of the throne. And after that, he became an absolutist monarch. He built the great palace of Versailles, which is one of the most lavish construction buildings in the world. It rivals the Forbidden City in Beijing. And he forced his nobles to live there for a good deal of the year so that he could keep an eye on them and keep control of them, as well as demonstrate his own power and his own authority, and impress foreign dignitaries, and hold military parades and so forth, and assert his authority. King Louis XIV also expanded France's borders via his strong military. In some respects, he expanded territory so much that he managed to create France's modern borders. He incorporated a lot of territories that had not been, strictly speaking, part of his kingdom, but we now consider part of France today. He also bankrupted the economy doing that, and France was in a tough situation after that, which would in part lead to its revolution about 70 years after his death. King Louis XIV is also famous for saying, quote, "I am the state." Right? It wasn't that I'm part of the state or the leader of the state. I, King Louis XIV, am the state. That is how absolute my authority is. Russia also had its 2 famous absolute monarchs, Peter I and Catherine I, both of whom sought to bring Russia closer to Europe. They really liked, now Catherine herself was part German, so she had some experience. She had lived in Europe. But both of them wanted to create a more European-style state. And so, for example, Peter the Great fought a very long war with Sweden in order to take the territory that became St. Petersburg. Now, Russia was landlocked for the most part, and Peter firmly believed that Russia needed a seaport to be a great power. So he fought this long war with Sweden to get this territory called St. Petersburg, where he then built a capital. Or the territory wasn't called St. Petersburg, but he built a capital called St. Petersburg as sort of a demonstration of his power. And then he moved there and spent all of his time there, kind of leaving behind Moscow and the old Russian capital and the old nobles. And Catherine the Great did much the same. She also expanded Russian territory. She took over the Crimea, which was another warm water port they could use all year round. And they also took over Alaska in the New World. Both of them tried their best to get along with their nobles, their boyars, and they allowed the boyars to take increasing control of the peasants. So while peasants had a much less good time than the nobles did, the serfs, I should say, they weren't really peasants at that point because they didn't have their own land. The boyars were also not exempt from the influence of these monarchs. So, for example, Peter the Great famously wanted his boyars to look Western. And so he insisted, hey, you got to cut off your beards. Russian lords had traditionally grown very long beards in keeping with practices in the Russian Orthodox Church. And if you don't want to take off your beard, you got to pay a tax. A lot of people couldn't afford the tax, so they just cut their beard off. Peter himself allegedly went around Moscow looking for people whose beards he could cut off because he was really mad about this. He also forced nobles to teach their sons geometry, or they weren't allowed to get married. And for a noble house, that's really bad. So you think geometry is bad in your class? Imagine if you weren't even allowed to get married until you mastered it. This is a diagram of Versailles right here. And this is a painting of Louis XIV. Notice that an angel is literally crowning him. This is some royal flex right here. This is the execution of the English King Charles I. This is how you get limited government. You cut the heads off of your kings every now and then kings don't act up too much. So what I'd also like to kind of wrap this up is something called the crisis of the 17th century. Now, what's interesting about this is that globally, not just in Europe, although most obviously in Europe, but globally, between 1600 and 1700, there are more wars and conflicts recorded than in any other period in recorded history. And by conflicts, I mean between states and organized groups. You had the English Civil War, you had the French Civil War, the Fronde, you had the invasion of the Qing to occupy the Ming Dynasty. You had multiple wars between the Ottomans and their Safavid rivals. You had conflicts between the Portuguese and the Moroccan dynasties. You had wars in the Americas between the French and their Indian allies and the British over beaver pelts in the Mississippi. So this was an incredibly violent time. And the question is, why was this so gosh darn violent? And part of it probably was the rise of complex states like we've talked about, right? More money and more weapons means you can wage more wars. So that's part of it. But it may also have something to do with the Little Ice Age. If we take a more global look at it, it's widely believed that the Little Ice Age, which was a long, I believe a 600-year drop, sorry, not 600, 500-year average temperature drop. So it doesn't mean it was freezing all the time, but over the course of about 500 years, the average temperature was lower every year for going forward, remained relatively lower than it had been the previous 500 years. And so as it gets colder, it becomes harder to grow crops, right? Crop failures become more frequent. And even when crops don't fail, the amount of food produced is less and less. Right? This leads to food riots. This leads to civil wars. People have noticed that famines in the Ottoman Empire picked up during this time, which led to civil unrest. This also meant an outbreak of plague and other diseases because hungry people don't have good immune systems. And so this climate change does really have an effect on the world globally. And while we think about the violence and the wars in Europe, and there were plenty of them, we need to also think of it as like a more global perspective, right? In the Little Ice Age, which affected Europe, but also affected places like China. Probably the worst war in Europe during the crisis of the 17th century was the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648 and was sort of the crescendo of the religious wars. And with the exception of France, who sided with the Protestants, you had all of the Catholic countries, Spain, Austria, the southern German states, the Italian states, Poland, and you had all the Protestant countries, Denmark, Sweden, England, the German states, Prussia, all siding against each other. And this was a 30 years war that just ripped through Central Europe. And mercenary armies just went haywire and like burned villages to the ground and slaughtered people and just committed violence on a scale that would not be seen for a really long time. So many people died that like predator animals started to come back that hadn't been seen in a long time. So like wolves began to make a comeback in some rural areas. People were getting attacked by wolves again because there were so few people that nobody was there to challenge the wolves. The Peace of Westphalia finally ended the war when all sides realized that they simply could not defeat each other definitively. And this sort of ends the wars of religion. It sort of ends by basically saying, hey, we can't get rid of each other. We're just going to have to get along. And it establishes something called the balance of power, which kind of permanently ends the idea that an empire will ever come back to Europe. Now, that's not to say people didn't try. So, for example, Napoleon tried to create a European-wide empire. And arguably, the Germans in World War I and then the Nazis in World War II also tried to create a European-wide empire. But in all cases, this idea that a balance of power must be maintained and that no one power should dominate the European continent would occupy the minds of many Europeans for a very long time and sort of signal the end of any possible empire coming back to Europe. Contrast this with other parts of the world where empires continue to exist and continue to be the norm for the next 300 years until the 20th century. So I want to thank you for joining me. You should be able to answer those 2 questions from the beginning of the History Bite. And my name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.